Welcome to this video tutorial. It's another model answer in minutes, and this time we're looking at paper 1, education, and in particular we're looking at patterns of educational achievement and cultural factors. So let's get into it. First thing you need to do is read that question once, twice, 3 times. Check what area and what topics of the course you are being examined on. So, apply material from the item and your knowledge, evaluate the importance of cultural factors in explaining patterns of educational achievement. So a couple of things to note. We do need to use the item at least once, but we don't want to be dependent on the item. It says your knowledge, so really you need to bring in your theoretical knowledge, the knowledge that you have of any studies that are relevant, the relevant concepts to develop your chain of reasoning. It also says evaluate, so we do need to evaluate, and it has to be explicit if we want to get into that top band. And it says the cultural factors in explaining patterns of educational achievement. So it does specify what area. It is an outside factor, an external factor, cultural factors, and it doesn't specify a specific social group. So it doesn't just say that they want you to talk about class, gender, or ethnicity. It could be any of them. So we are really looking at cultural factors and patterns of achievement. Those two ideas need to be returned to in every paragraph. So when we're looking at cultural factors, it's anything that happens outside of home, outside of school, sorry. So at home. So the language at home, attitudes and values at home towards education, how have students been socialised, what intellectual stimulation is there at home, and do they possess cultural capital? Have they been socialised into a culture which is valued by the education system? Those are the topics they want to see in this essay. Now, because it says patterns of achievement, like I said before, it doesn't specifically specify a group. So we can talk about class, gender, or ethnicity, or indeed all of them. So I've highlighted the item where it's kind of hinted at talking about class, gender, or ethnicity. And also, just as a reminder, I've highlighted the cultural factors. What I don't want to do is start talking about material factors or inside factors as my main part of the paragraph. So the next slide, is the examiner's report. We're going to look at the examiner's report to see what the do's and don'ts were the year that students took the exam where this question came up. So examiner's reports is something that many students miss when they're revising, and I think it's so important because the examiners write up a report about factors that went well and parts of the essays that didn't score so highly. So as you can see here, it says there was a good range and depth of cultural factors. So to have a good range and depth, we need to have at least, I'd say, 3 decent paragraphs on cultural factors. It says the more successful answers were able to explain how material factors may underpin cultural factors, that they may compensate for cultural factors, or that material and cultural factors are intertwined. So whenever you're given a factor and asked to say whether or not it has the most significant impact, it's always best, if you're heading for or you're aiming for the top band, it's always best to talk about the factors that may mix together. So it's not a case of just cultural factors. It's not a case of just class. It's a case of looking inside as well as out. And when we look at class, gender, and ethnicity, the patterns in achievement become much more complicated. Furthermore, more successful students were able to provide further explicit evaluation of the cultural factors outlined. So some criticised cultural deprivation explanations as victim blaming, as to why they don't account for why some groups still manage to do well despite being attached to that certain culture. So that's the examiner's report. Let's get planning. So if you've watched some of my videos before, you will be familiar with my essay planning sheet. So let me just take a moment to explain it. So what you can see is there is an introduction box where I will get my students to plan an introduction, and these should be brief. Then what I have is the opportunity for at least four Peely paragraphs. Now you'll see the word Tesco in each of the boxes because what I tell my students is to go shopping in Tesco. And that means that when you're writing out your paragraph or you're planning your paragraph, try to get these elements into your chain of reasoning. The more of these elements, the higher the likelihood is that you'll be in the top band. So T stands for theory, E explicit evaluation, S studies, C concepts, O obvious examples. So if this is a question that's asking you to look at cultural factors, we need box 1, 2 and 3 at least to contain different cultural explanations for achievement or underachievement. So let's have a look at language, because we know that is an external factor that's related to the culture at home. Attitudes and values, we know that's related to different cultural backgrounds, so different cultures have different attitudes and values. And cultural capital, so whether you've been socialised into cultural capital will impact how well you do at school. That does mean that paragraph 4 needs to be an alternative idea, so we could have anything other than cultural factors. So in this case, I've popped material deprivation. Now, one of the things that you need to note with the 4th paragraph, or your alternative paragraph, it should be short. I always say to my students, no more than 5 sentences, but most importantly, this paragraph shouldn't be a standalone juxtaposition paragraph. It should, however, be more comparative. So in that paragraph, you are going to get that intertwining argument that material deprivation might also, once coupled with cultural deprivation, better, more fully answer why achievement levels are the way they are. So let's start with the introduction. So introductions need to be short. They need to be very brief in what they do, because it shouldn't take long. We just want to introduce the trend. We want to define what the issue is before we actually explain why it is an issue. So what we're going to do first is we are going to tell them the statistics on achievement. So who are the overachievers, who are the underachievers? So that can take a sentence. So you're just defining the trend. You're going to get AO1 marks for that. Then make sure that you explain what cultural factors are. What theory is cultural factors looking at? What theory looks at that, sorry. So cultural deprivation theory is your theory, and then hint at some of the reasons that you might see in this essay. So poor socialisation, language, attitudes. At this point, you can refer to the item, of course, because the item contains hints of these anyway, in particular, poor socialisation. So overall, an introduction should be short. Tell them the trend in achievement, and since it's not just class, ethnicity or gender, I've talked about all of them, and hint at what you're going to be talking about in the essay. Make sure you try to get as many concepts or keywords in, rather than just an empty sentence like we're going to look at this and then we're going to look at that. So cultural deprivation gets me some reward. Also things like poor socialisation, language and attitudes. Okay, let's have a look at the first paragraph. So the first cultural factor we said on the plan was looking at language. So you've got to make a point. So make the point that cultural explanation does tend to link language as an important factor in achievement, and you can link this to class as well as ethnicity. Make sure you bring in the key person associated with this theory, and of course that is Bernstein. And then we need to explain how language differences, language codes could impact achievement. So here you can pause the video and read through the explanation. And what I want you to pay attention to is not only do we explain what Bernstein argued in relation to class and ethnicity, but we're also then linking actual subjects where your language does have an impact on success. So you'll note that we've got English language, even science has been linked to the importance of language with precise terminology, and how some students might struggle in their explanations if they've got to learn certain terminology. We've also got a link to ethnicity with Wright and the study by Wright, where they talk about Chinese pupils being left out of discussions because of their language, the assumptions around their ability to understand language. So a really good chunky paragraph, and you'll see plenty of tests go in there. We have got a theoretical idea, we've got concepts, we've got Bernstein and Wright, we've got obvious examples of the actual subjects where language is going to be impacted. And so we are on to a winner. All we've got to do now is evaluate. So the evaluation has to be explicit. It can't just be an alternative idea. So here we've got a methodological issue. We're going to say Bernstein's ideas have been criticised because we're generalising, and yet there's a lack of empirical depth to his ideas. He didn't do any large-scale observation. His was theoretical rather than empirically backed up. We've also then want to hint at this idea that we can't just look at ethnicity, we can't just look at class, we can't just look inside, we can't just look at outside. So here we've got critics argue that it doesn't explain why some ethnic minorities pupils excel, who have English as an additional language, and yet may get labelled, may have issues with language, but excel, they overachieve. And then the Swan report backing this up by saying it's not language that's the most important, it's actually material factors. So we've got a hint at what our potential conclusion could be, this idea that we can't just look at cultural factors without assessing material factors. Let's have a look at paragraph 2. So paragraph 1, paragraph 2 is now on attitudes and values. So let's have a look at how we would construct that paragraph. First of all, we need to make sure we are looking at class, ethnicity and gender. We want to kind of not focus on just one at the expense of the other. We want to showcase our knowledge, so try to mention class, ethnicity and gender wherever possible. So make the point about attitudes and values. So what is the values and attitudes point to make? Well, it's this idea that in terms of cultural deprivation theory, certain social groups, their gaps in achievement are as a result of their parents, their parental attitudes, the values they've been socialised into, because it's the argument that it can shape the children's motivation and behaviour in school. So we're getting a hint again at the outside factor is going to impact an inside factor. So your motivation at school, the behaviour in school could be determined by what goes on at home with your parents. Are they positive? Are they pro-school? Are they anti-school? We've got to explain it by backing it up with an example. We've got to back it up with studies and theory. So we're going to bring in Feinstein. You can stop the video and read through this chunky paragraph, but I just want to draw your attention to the fact that we have got plenty of examples of school subjects that are impacted by the attitudes and values you're socialised into. So pause the video, have a look and note the examples. You'll also see that not only Feinstein is mentioned, but also Sugarman, who talks about class differences in attitudes and how that might hinder school. Now on to the evaluation. Postmodernists would argue the significance of one cultural factor, like attitudes and values, is just one of many. So again, a hint at that logical conclusion that we can't just look at outside factors, we've got to look inside factors as well. We've linked it to labelling theory to say that outside attitudes can impact what goes on in the classroom. Therefore, labelling may start if pupils are disruptive. Teachers might label them, and then that could impact their achievement. So above all, what we're trying to say in the evaluation is it's not clear, it's not black and white. It has to be this idea that when we're looking at achievement levels, when we add in class, ethnicity and gender, it's very rare that you can seldom argue that it is a culture, an attitude, because you're always going to get parents and attitudes that differ from class to class, ethnicity to ethnicity and by gender as well. And not every family is the same, so we can't overgeneralise. We've also, which is really good, got some policies that, okay, if these cultural factors are a big deal, policies have tried to minimise the impact. And I've given some examples of those. So pause the video now and have a look at this chunky paragraph, have a look at the Tesco, have a look at the explicit evaluation. So far we've looked at language and attitudes and values. Let's go on to cultural capital. So with cultural capital, we can bring in the Marxist argument from Bordeaux. So briefly outline what you mean by cultural capital, who has it, who doesn't. And here you can see I've linked it to both class and ethnicity. Now explain what you mean by cultural capital and why having it or not having it is important. Again, obvious examples in music and art, as well as modern foreign languages. So pause the video, have a little look at the chain of reasoning here, as well as the examples. The evaluation, again, we bring back to the postmodernist argument that you can't look at just one idea. So cultural capital, yes, is important. It's a cultural factor. It is important, but it might be overstated. Shouldn't schools be the ones that install cultural capital in their students? In fact, Ofsted made it one of their key things to look for when they go around and inspect schools. So we're getting that kind of explicit evaluation by saying let's not overstate, overgeneralize. And then we've got this idea that it's victim blaming, you know, overstating the fact that, well, if you're working class or you're a certain ethnic group, that you won't have enough cultural capital. And actually that is just blaming the culture of the student, which is not fair. So that's your third paragraph. It's a chunky one. I would stop the video and just have a look at all of the wonderful Tesco shopping I've done to bring you this model paragraph. Next up is going to be the alternative paragraph on material deprivation. So as you can see on the screen now, those are our three cultural factors. Like I said, let's have a look at material deprivation as an alternative. But remember, it cannot be a standalone, this is just what causes achievement differences, it's material deprivation. You've got to be answering the questions. For that, we need to compare and contrast with the original arguments of cultural factors. So it might look like this. Despite cultural factors playing a part, postmodernists argue it's likely that gaps in achievement are actually a mixture of factors. Explain what you mean. Well, material deprivation, it's argued, may be even more of an issue. Sullivan's survey shows that although cultural capital, for example, contributes to achievement, its effect is weaker than material factors like income, access to private tuition, stable housing. So therefore, economic factors need to be understood, not just cultural. So you'll note that that paragraph has cultural factors running through it completely, and yet a nod to maybe it is material deprivation as well. So a very strong comparative paragraph. Also draw your attention to the fact that we've got a theory in there, postmodernists, and we've also got a theory of material deprivation backed up by Sullivan and Flaherty as well. So that is your last paragraph. On to the conclusion. So a conclusion should be logical to get into the top band, so it shouldn't have any new information. And as we've looked at postmodernist argument throughout this essay, it would make sense to conclude with that. So here is the very short conclusion. Overall, it is clear cultural deprivation provides convincing arguments that backed up with evidence. However, postmodernists argue it's wrong to assume one factor is responsible like culture. It's too deterministic, and instead we need to understand how multiple factors like poverty and culture may be responsible. So as per examiner's report, we have tried to hint at the idea that it's not a straightforward answer. I hope that's been helpful for you, and that is just under 20 minutes for your model answer. Until next time.